Press out of New York, and it is a collection of interviews that he gave to various reporters from around the world about these events. So that book is certainly out there and is available. But here this morning, we welcome questions and comments. The number here in Champaign-Urbana, 333-9455. We do also have a toll-free line, and that's good anywhere that you can hear us around Illinois and Indiana, or if you're listening over the Internet and you're in the United States, you can use that number too, and that is 800-222-9455. Again, 333-WILL, that's just another way to think about it, and toll-free 800-222-WILL. Professor Chomsky, hello.
Hi, how are you?
I'm fine, thanks, and thank you for talking with us.
Okay.
Before doing anything else, I want to give you the opportunity to do as you have done, and that is to make it clear to people that, in no uncertain terms, that you condemn the acts of last September. And the reason that I ask the question is simply because I think that there has been a great, for anyone, for you and anybody else, who has talked about those events and said something like, well, you know, I think it's really important to understand the context in which they occur. There has been a great deal of negative criticism, as if somehow by saying that you're excusing what happened last September, and I know that you, for your part, certainly do not.
Yeah, first, let me qualify. It is not correct that people who've said we should look at the reasons are being condemned on that basis. For example, no one has condemned the Wall Street Journal, as far as I'm aware, for immediately, to its credit, doing investigations of the background attitudes in the region that might account for not support, but some degree of sympathy for this. And in fact, every specialist I've read, or many journals, has done the same thing, because it's just elementary rationality. The only people who've been criticized for doing this are people who are also critical of U.S. policy. So therefore, it's not the question of looking for reasons that's being criticized. That's a cover for the stance that says we've got to obediently parrot everything that comes out of Washington. So we should be clear about that. As for me, I'm like everybody else. I mean, my first comment on September 11th and 12th, when I was asked by reporters from here and elsewhere to comment, was that it was a horrendous atrocity committed with awesome cruelty, so on and so forth. Yeah, like everyone else.
Talk about the context, the background. What is it that you think that people in this country, as they think about what happened, and perhaps also as they think about what the appropriate response would be, what is it that you think Americans should know?
Well, there are a lot of things we should know. For one thing, there is, we'll take the question of proper response. There are many questions one can ask about proper response, but whatever answer one gives, it should at least satisfy the most elementary moral truism that I can think of. Namely, if some act is right for us, it's right for others. If it's wrong for others, it's wrong for us. People who can't accept that don't even rise to the level where we can even discuss their attitudes towards right and wrong. So we have to accept at least that principle. And then we can ask, well, okay, what is the right response for anyone to terrorist acts? For example, what is the right response, say, let's take an uncontroversial case. What is the right response, was the right response for Nicaragua to a terrorist war that the U.S. carried out, which was much more severe even than September 11th, killed tens of thousands of people were killed. The country was devastated, may never even recover. And it's an uncontroversial case because in that case, the United States was condemned by the highest authorities for international terrorism, by the International Court of Justice, and would have been condemned by the Security Council, except that the U.S. vetoed the resolution on the General Assembly and so on. So it's uncontroversial. So then what was the right response? Well, was the right response to carry out some form of terror inside the United States, let's say, bombing or bioterror or whatever? And nobody believes that. I mean, that would be outrageous. Accordingly, it's not the right response for us either. Or take a current case right now, this minute. The official U.S. position. Remember that overthrowing the Taliban regime was not a war aim. That came much later, weeks after the bombing began. After the bombing, the official war aim, as announced by the president, was mid-October. Turn over to us. He told the Afghans, we're going to continue to bomb you unless you turn over to us people who we suspect of terrorism, although we're not going to present you with any evidence, and we'll not even pay attention to your tentative offers to negotiate, serious or not, we don't know because they were dismissed. Well, if that's the right response, then it's the right response for others. So, for example, take, say, Haiti. The United States is harboring major war criminals. For example, Emmanuel Constant, who's the head of the paramilitary forces that were responsible for killing 4 or 5,000 people during the military regime, the military junta in the early 90s, which incidentally the U.S. tacitly supported. They've been calling, he's been sentenced in absentia in Haiti. They've been calling for his extradition. They're not demanding that the U.S. turn him over without evidence. They have, nobody questions the evidence. They're demanding extradition. They continue to do that. I mean, the latest case was September 30th, right in the middle of the talk about the Taliban handing over people the U.S. suspected without providing evidence. The U.S. dismissed that request, as it always has. It was scarcely reported. Probably they don't want to turn him over because his contacts with the CIA will be revealed during these massacres. But whatever the reason, they didn't turn him over. Okay, does that give Haiti the right to carry out, assuming they were capable of it, terrorist attacks inside the United States? Well, again, that's utterly outrageous. But then the elementary moral truism applies. So what is the right response? Well, I think the right response is the one that indeed has been proposed by very respectable sources. So the Vatican, for example, or the preeminent Anglo-American military historian, Michael Howard. He actually proposed it last October, but it's in an article in Foreign Affairs, the main establishment journal, in January. He points out, and he is very conservative, highly supportive of British imperialism, even more of the United States. His proposal, which sounds reasonable to me, is that in the case of a criminal conspiracy, which has carried out massive crimes against humanity, in fact, in the case of such a criminal conspiracy, the right approach is careful police work to identify the culprits. If you have evidence identifying them, turn to an appropriate international authority, which may authorize force if they won't be turned over. And incidentally, we don't know in this case whether they would have been turned over because the initiatives were dismissed. But if they won't turn them over, an international authority, which would be the Security Council, would authorize an international operation to apprehend them, at which point they would be brought to trial in an international tribunal, so it could be a fair trial, and they should be sentenced. Essentially what was done with Timothy McVeigh or IRA bombers and others. That sounds to me like a reasonable approach, but again, the moral truism applies, and the same would be true when our leaders are condemned for international terrorism. Or take another approach, which was proposed, take Afghan voices. I think it's worth listening to them. And there were plenty of them. So in late October, at the time when U.S. war aims shifted to regime change, around October 28th, right at that time there was a conference of 1,000 Afghan leaders under the auspices of the United States held in Peshawar, Afghanistan, many of them from exile, many trekked in from inside Afghanistan. It was pretty well reported. Everyone can find out about it. They disagreed. It was very highly regarded by the reporters, incidentally. They said it was a remarkable meeting of high-level tribal leaders, political figures, and others. They disagreed about a lot of things, but there was one thing they were unanimous about: stop the bombing. Because the bombing is undercutting their efforts, which they felt could succeed, to overthrow the Taliban regime from within, because they realized, as indeed was obvious, that it was very thin, had very little support, and could easily collapse even if leadership, sub-leadership elements were bought off. They said the bombing is undermining our efforts to overthrow it without destruction of the country. The same position exactly was taken by the U.S. favorite, Abdul Haq, who the U.S. was really counting on to be their man in Afghanistan. Right about the same time, about a week earlier, right after the bombing, he bitterly condemned the bombing, said that the U.S. is doing it just to show its muscle, doesn't care about the effects on Afghanistan. And again, he said, as the tribal leaders did, that it's undercutting his efforts, which he thought could be effective. He claimed he had contacts already with people inside Afghanistan who would move towards undermining the regime because they hated it, as did much of the population, and because it was understood to be very kind of a ragtag force that ought to collapse very quickly. He actually went into Afghanistan and was killed, apparently because he didn't have any U.S. support. But those are all RAWA, the main women's organization, which has a record of extreme courage and effectiveness right through the Russian occupation and the Taliban years. They were saying the same thing. Well, maybe Afghans don't understand their country as well as people who couldn't have placed it on a map a couple of months ago. But it doesn't seem entirely obvious. So yes, there were definite alternatives, which were not pursued, in fact, not even contemplated.
We have a couple of callers, and I want to bring them into the conversation here and also introduce again our guest. We're speaking this morning with Noam Chomsky, well known as a political activist. He's also professor of linguistics at MIT, where he's taught since 1955. We're talking this morning about the terrorist attacks of last fall and the war on terror. Your questions, comments are welcome. We have two people who are ready to go here. We'll start with the caller in Urbana on line 1.
Hi, Professor Chomsky. Thanks for joining us this morning. I have a question regarding the recent buzz about the missing nuclear devices.
About what? I'm sorry, I didn't hear.
The missing mobile nuclear devices.
Mobile nuclear devices, yeah.
That they've been, the recent buzz in the last 2 days. Can you envision a possibility in which one or several of those might be used in this country?
I'm sorry, I don't understand the question. On the part, mobile nuclear devices, in whose hands?
In the hands of the terrorists, the Al-Qaeda organization.
As far as I'm aware, the U.S. government has said that explicitly that it has no evidence that they had any access to any, not only nuclear devices, but even radioactive materials. In fact, the U.S. government has been claiming that they were apparently, they're trying to get them, but that they were cheated by their criminal contact. So I don't know of any evidence that they had mobile nuclear devices. And I doubt it very much. If they had them, they would have used them.
Right, and assuming for the moment that, bin Laden has called for the destruction of the USA, if we were to pull our troops out of Saudi Arabia and also, really push the peace process for an independent Palestinian state, do you think if the U.S. government really try to do the right thing, do you think negotiations might start with the alternative organizations, the terrorist organizations, or do you think that any kind of negotiation might be not possible?
I doubt very much that one could have any negotiations with these terrorist organizations, but I don't really think that's the issue. Remember, the U.S. government understands those organizations very well because it helped create them and was organizing, training, and arming them right through the 1980s. Maybe not bin Laden himself, but certainly the organizations. In fact, the U.S. Special Forces, who were trying to dig them out of the caves of Tora Bora, are the same U.S. Special Forces who were training them in the 1980s. So yes, the government knows them very well. I doubt very much that there's possibilities of negotiation or even that it's an issue. We can see their behavior. For example, they hate the Russians more than anyone in the world, probably, except maybe the Saudi Arabian government. And they fought the Russians. And when the Russians, and they were carrying out terrorist activities inside Russia, remember, with U.S. support. Terrorist activities that were serious enough so that they practically led to a war between Russia and Pakistan in the 80s, which could have exploded into a global war. However, when the Russians pulled out, although they continued to despise the Russians, who they regard as indistinguishable from the United States, they stopped terrorist activities against Russia, at least from Afghanistan. They may have continued them from Chechnya, but not from Afghanistan. And the reason is that all the evidence points to the fact that, whatever one thinks about them, they seem to live up pretty much to what they say. They've been saying for 20 years what they intend. It's not a secret, and their actions more or less conform to it. They want to drive the infidels out of their lands, Muslim lands, and install ultra extremist Islamic regimes in the Muslim lands. That's what they say, and that's apparently what they do.
We have several other callers, and I want to get onto those people in a moment. I also want to say thanks to the last caller. This is Focus 580, our telephone talk program. My name is David Inge, and again, our guest this morning is Noam Chomsky. And we have several other people here in line ready to go. Our next caller is in Champaign, and on line number 2.
Hello, Professor Chomsky. I have a rather long question. It's about the logic or the illogic of Sharon's positions towards, finding peace or making war. And
speak a little louder. I can't quite hear.
I'm sorry. I wanted to ask you about the logic or illogic of Sharon's position towards peace or war, finding war. And he seems to have sort of a paradigm, an old Israeli paradigm of an iron wall, setting up an iron wall, and then slamming the Palestinians in order to get them to talk about peace. And I was wondering, to what extent you think he's in touch with reality in terms of, he seems to be inflaming and militarizing Palestinians and Muslims all over the world, and how this relates to U.S. relations to Israel or to our attempt to try to not be threatened by terrorism, whether that's helping our particular needs to not be bombed or terrorized, and like what the consequences of Sharon's policy is for the Middle East or for the world, and what American citizens, whether they can have any effect on Middle East peace given the two fanatical sides. I mean, I'm not saying everybody in either camp is fanatical, but it seems like there's always someone who's going to, put a wrench in the works on either side.
Yeah. Well, I think there's a lot of truth to what you say, but it's omitting something.
Okay.
What it's omitting is the U.S. role.
That's what I'm asking about.
The U.S. role is putting a wrench into every attempt to reach a diplomatic settlement, and it's been doing so ever since 1976.
And for what reasons and how?
Well, let's start with how. We know how. We can only, speculate about the reasons. But the way you're describing it is, in fact, the way it's described in the press. So if you read, say, Todd Purdum's review in the New York Times, I think yesterday, he describes it exactly like that. He says the fanatics on both sides have been undermining the genuine U.S. efforts to achieve peace, quotes George Shultz 20 years ago saying the same thing, and so on. The trouble with that story is it's just totally false. In 1976, January 1976, the Security Council debated a resolution calling for a peaceful diplomatic settlement on the internationally recognized border pre-June 67. Everybody recognizes that, including officially at least the United States, including all the crucial wording of UN 242, the basic resolution, calling for recognition of the right of every state in the region to live in peace and security with recognized borders and so on and so forth, and calling for a Palestinian state and the territories from which Israel would withdraw. Peaceful political settlement. That's January 1976. Who supported it? Answer, the entire world. It was introduced by the Arab confrontation states, as they're called, Syria, Jordan, and Egypt. It was publicly supported by the PLO, supported by the Europeans, by Eastern Europe, Latin America. In fact, it was essentially unanimous, except for Israel, which strongly opposed it, and the United States, which vetoed it. According to the Israeli ambassador, Chaim Herzog, later president, the PLO not only supported it, but actually prepared the resolution. I don't believe him, but that illustrates the Israeli perspective. Well, such initiatives continued from the Arab states, Europe, and others for a year, constantly. The U.S. continually blocked them. There's a lot of talk now about the Saudi peace plan. Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a Saudi peace plan. It's approximately the same one as Saudi Arabia offered in 1981. Mm-hmm. Israel's reaction was, as the Israeli press described it, hysterical. They even sent planes over the U.S. jets over Israel. They're called Israeli jets, but they're U.S. jets with Israeli pilots over the oil fields as a warning that if the U.S. went along with this, they'd blow up the oil fields. The Herzog, the president, bitterly condemned it. Shimon Peres said who's supposed to be the dove, that if it's considered, it'll be the end of Israel. The U.S. backed them in that refusal. That killed the FAD plan in 1981. And so it continued right till the present. So in December of last year, so December 2001, the Security Council once again debated a resolution which involved the only meaningful way to reduce the level of violence on both sides, namely to introduce international observers. That works. Unarmed international observers. That can be effective, has been in other cases within the occupied territories in the few places where it's happened. It's had an effect, and it's the one way to reduce the violence. And they also called for implementing the U.S. Mitchell Plan. The U.S. government vetoed it. It went to the General Assembly, where it was approved almost unanimously. The U.S. voted against it, along with Israel and a couple of Pacific islands. That enhances terror, to use the President's words. 10 days before that, on December 5th, there was a very important conference in Switzerland on the Fourth Geneva Convention. These are conventions that were established in 1949 after the Second World War. Their goal was to formally criminalize the crimes of the Nazis. And the U.S., of course, is one of the signers, in fact, one of the high contracting parties. Everyone involved, the whole world, including the official the agency that's responsible for implementing the plan, the International Red Cross, all agree that the Fourth Convention applies to the occupied territories. In fact, that was voted unanimously by the United Nations, by the Security Council in October 2000, once again, the U.S. abstaining. It doesn't want to vote against it, but it abstains. So it therefore is just international law. They met again on December 5th. They reiterated, the European Union participated, others reiterated that the convention applies to the occupied territories fully. They declared all the settlements illegal. The conventions, if you read them, determine that just about everything the U.S. and Israel are doing in the occupied territories is a grave breach of the Geneva Conventions, in layman's terms, a war crime, serious war crime.
But what's the motivation?
The U.S. refused to attend the meeting, which kills it, and it wasn't reported here. Well, those are ways of enhancing terror, and that's a way of throwing a wrench into any kind of peace process.
Well, maybe I'm mixing.
25 years. We can ask why, but it certainly happened.
Right. Maybe I'm mixing religion and politics, but I mean, there are certain people, fanatical people, that believe that they must occupy these territories because this is.
Yes, and they're in Washington.
Right. And why are they in Washington? What is the logic, or is this completely unreasonable?
Well, then we're shifting from the question how to the question why. Mm-hmm. Okay, but before we can ask the question why, we have to recognize the facts. And it's quite important to realize that though the facts are not controversial, they are scarcely known in the United States because they're simply not reported. Mm-hmm. Okay, but once we pay attention to the facts, we can then seriously ask the question, well, why has the United States been consistently blocking the international consensus calling for a diplomatic settlement? And I think the answers are pretty clear. I can review it if you want briefly, but I've written about it extensively if you want to look. But in 1958, way back then, the National Security Council recognized that what they called a logical corollary of our opposition to Arab nationalism. They call it radical Arab nationalism, but that just means independent Arab nationalism. A logical corollary to opposition to that would be support for Israel as the only reliable base for U.S. power in the region, alongside Turkey and a couple of others. They didn't do much about it at the time, but in 1967, when Israel performed a major service to the United States by wiping out the main center of secular Arab nationalism, namely Nasser, at that point, U.S. relations with Israel firmed up, and they became very close as Israel became what the Nixon administration called one of the cops on the beat, meaning local, powerful, non-Arab states, Turkey and Iran, then under the Shah were others, which protect the very weak and corrupt Arab monarchies from independent nationalism. And the U.S. aid to Israel shot up, and it continued to perform that service. It performs it until this day. Further, by now it's virtually an offshore U.S. military base, as well as an offshore base for U.S. high-tech production, very closely linked to the U.S. In fact, virtually an extension of it. So yes, they want it to be as powerful as possible. In contrast, the Palestinians offer nothing. They have no arms, they have no power, they have no force. They're useless. So therefore, if they can be subjected to Israeli domination, that's fine.
We're moving into our last 20 minutes. The lines are full, and I hope, again, the last caller will forgive me for wanting to go on and give somebody else a chance. Let's go next to the next person in line, and that would be Charleston and line 4. Hello.
Yes, I'd like to raise the issue above the individual incidences such as September 11th, and with an eye toward the capitalist hegemony, and say that the U.S. then becomes the most dominant hegemonic power in capitalism over the world, and then the process would somehow shift and someone else would fulfill that role. And then it appears to me that we are doomed to act out those old paradigms over and over again until we get some sort of revolutionary activity that will steer us away from bourgeois capitalism, namely into a worker state, which is the only place I can see where there might be some new order or a new paradigm that will help humanity from these deadly situations we see ourselves in now. And when the U.S. Took away, if I'm informed right, the world hegemony from England at the close of World War II, and then proceeded on the course that we are now trying to sustain, it is going to be impossible to kill 1 billion Muslims and anybody else that doesn't agree with us, set up these client states that will act out our wishes and keep the money and the natural resources flowing into this country. While the world starves, the U.S. is becoming overweight and undereducated, and all the other things that appear to me to be happening in the decaying process of capitalism per se. I'll ring off and give someone else a chance and listen on the radio. Thank you very much.
Right. Well, Dr. Chomsky, you can comment on that any way you like.
Well, first of all, just as a side comment, to say that the U.S. is becoming fat and rich is not quite accurate. According to government figures, there are about 30 million Americans who are facing serious hunger every day. For the majority of the population, real wages have stagnated or even declined over the past 20, 25 years. Americans have the highest workload in the world just to keep food on the table. So it's not the case that one should not think of the United States as an entity. It has divisions. And the same is true of the rest of the world. You take the most miserable country in Central Africa. They had representatives at the World Economic Forum. Their elites live in super luxury. If you travel to these countries, you can barely believe it. And they're part of the international system that you're more or less describing. So it's essentially a class division. It's not. Of course, there are more. The United States is richer, so dominant elements are more concentrated here than in Central Africa. But this is an international system. Now, we could talk about the question you raise. Interesting, important question, but very, very long range. There are shorter range issues that ought to be addressed. So, for example, a month ago, there was an extremely important conference, which I felt privileged to be able to attend in Porto Alegre, Brazil, of the World Social Forum. 50 or 60,000 people coming from all over the world, all walks of life, peasants, steel workers, environmentalists, anything you can think of. And they were working hard and significantly on a form of international integration, globalization, which would be in the interests of the general population of the world, not narrow sectors of investors. Well, that's not a revolutionary program, but it's a constructive program, and it can happen. There have been many changes over the years. We don't live the way we did 200 years ago or even 30 years ago. There's been plenty of progress in advancing human rights, women's rights, minority rights, civil rights in general. There have been many constraints imposed on state violence from within. There's a lot to do, but there's plenty of progress. It doesn't come as a gift from above. No rights ever come that way. It's come as a result of committed, dedicated efforts to change things from within, a popular struggle. And it has its achievements. It can have more achievements. You can raise questions about what the right kind of long-term goal and vision ought to be, and that's interesting to think about and important. But more critical, in my view at least, is dealing with the questions that are on the table right now and that we can do something about.
Let's go to another caller. This is Champaign County, and it's line 3. Hello?
Hi, I wanted for you to review your trip to Kurdistan, and I noticed that several days after you came back, that it seemed that this announcement came out of Kurdistan, saying that the Iraqi Kurds didn't want to be dupes and they wouldn't support an overthrow of Saddam unless they were, knew what was going to come after. But I also feel like I should ask about the great oil question. I hope I don't ask it in a stereotypical way, but you didn't mention Kennan's. You were pointed at NSC reports in that, but Kennan calling the Middle East the greatest oil prize in the world, or some words to that effect, seems necessary to look at. And I've heard you say several times in recorded speeches that oil is always in the background, but it seems with the current oligarchy, it's more in the foreground. We have, Karzad and Kazalazad, I hope I'm getting their names closely, both having had worked on UNICAL, and now they're on complementary positions. Our each special representative to Afghanistan, and Karzai is the fellow that we've picked to try to stabilize the situation. And then I think just this past Sunday night on 60 Minutes, I heard that the Iraqi National Congress, who you've also written about quite a bit, offered to, in advance, cut a deal with two major oil companies if they would help lobby the Bush administration for more assets towards their supposed overthrow from the north. That's a lot, and I'd like for you to respond.
Okay, that's too much for me to try to talk, too big a bite for me to try to take. Let me make clear, I was in Turkish, the Kurdistan, the Kurdish areas of Turkey, not of Iraq. The southeast of Turkey, there are 10 or 15 million people living essentially in a dungeon after most of the countryside was devastated in some of the worst ethnic cleansing and atrocities of the 1990s, for which you and I and the rest of us are responsible. Most of the funding, 80% of the arms came from the United States in an increasing flow as the terrorism increased. And it was a real horror story, not known to people here because they didn't report it. We don't report our crimes. But that's where I was, not in the... and I must say it was an inspiring experience just to see the courage and resolution and even optimism of people who've been subjected to horrendous atrocities and have very little outside support. I mean, I've never had a welcome like that in my life. And it's not because of anything I did. It's just because somebody came to say simple things, like you have a right to speak your own language. That's what we're doing there. That's southeastern Turkey. Iraq is a different story. As far as the oil, and there's plenty to talk about that, but I'll turn to the other question. It's certainly true that oil is always in the background when you talk about this region. It wasn't just Kennan, it was the whole State Department, Eisenhower, everyone else, who described back in the 40s, described that region as as a stupendous source of strategic power and the greatest material prize in world history. Of course, the U.S. was going to dominate. It still does. Not because the U.S. needed the oil. In fact, it didn't. It wasn't even using oil from that region until 20 years ago, and not much now. But because it wants to control the oil, as Kennan, first of all, because of the profits, which are enormous, but also because it's a lever of world control. As Kennan pointed out, it gives us veto power over others if we control it. Now, as far as Iraq is concerned, there's good reason for it's been clear all along that somehow or other the United States will make moves to regain control over Iraq. The reason is that Iraq has the second largest oil reserves in the world, second to Saudi Arabia, and the U.S. is not going to either relinquish them or allow privileged access to rivals at the moment, France and Russia. So yes, the U.S. will do something to take control of Iraq. The Iraqi Kurds have every reason to be suspicious. They've been betrayed, exploited and betrayed over and over again by everyone, including the United States. And it's been extremely destructive to them. So yes, they're suspicious. As for the Bush administration and oil, you're right. It's the connections between the Bush administration and the energy corporations are more blatant and obvious than is normally the case. But it's a matter of degree. The policies aren't all that different from before. It's true that Khalilzad, Bush's appointment in Afghanistan, was and maybe still is a Unical consultant, as was Karzai, the U.S. choice for president. But all administrations are in agreement about this, and I don't think myself that it's a top issue. They'd like to have a pipeline through Afghanistan, but there are much more important things, like, for example, controlling Iraqi oil, or setting up. One of the major outcomes of the wars of the last couple of months has been that the U.S. has been able to establish what looks like a permanent military presence in Central Asia, in Uzbekistan and the other nearby countries. That means the U.S. is strongly supporting regimes which are not very different from the Taliban. Take a look at Uzbekistan's record; it's about the same. And it's a new military base. The U.S. has them all over the world. Now it has one in Central Asia. It doesn't make the surrounding countries very happy, to put it mildly, Russia, China, and certainly Iran. And it's a source of, there are plenty of, it'll have the usual problems, but that's a change in the structure of world power, maybe the major change that took place after the war in Afghanistan.
We have, pardon me for interrupting you, Dr. Chomsky, we just have about 5 minutes left, less actually, and I want to try to at least get one more caller. Let's go to Urbana line 1. Hello.
Yeah, hello. Thanks for squeezing me in. I heard Dr. Chomsky was in India fairly recently, and I was wondering if he would comment on Arundhati Roy's situation there. I understand she may be in court Wednesday, and maybe along the same lines, what do you think of the prospects of anybody out there, maybe Europe, I don't know who, acting as to hold us back from our worst excesses on a world basis? I know Arundhati Roy is very outspoken about giving us heck for what we've been doing, and I just wanted to hear a little bit about her and what you think the prospects are. Thank you.
I know her personally. She's a wonderful person. First of all, a marvelous writer, but also an extremely courageous woman who doesn't take any nonsense from anyone. You're right. She was brought up to the Supreme Court on the charge that she defamed them by telling the truth about what they're up to. They couldn't find any charge against her, so they're seeking some defamation charge. It's a total scandal. She's coming up again. She refuses. All they want her to do is grovel and say, "Well, I'm wrong. I'm sorry. I insulted you." She won't do it. She says, "No, I told the truth. I'm going to continue to tell the truth." And they can't take that. So they're trying to find some phony legal basis to charge her and send her to jail. It's coming up again this week. She ought to get plenty of outside support, and that's the only thing that'll stop them, as in all cases. As for other countries holding the United States back, yeah, they can do something. But the primary place to work is here. U.S., just like any other government, U.S. power can be impeded by its own population, primarily. That's certainly the case for an overwhelming superpower. And it can be done. This has become a much more civilized country in the last 30 or 40 years. No U.S. president today could dream of doing what John F. Kennedy did 40 years ago without any protest at all when he sent the U.S. Air Force to start bombing South Vietnam. He did it, no question about it. But there was no protest for years. No president could even think of that today. It's because the country has changed and has become more civilized. And we can continue that process. It's in our hands, not in the hands of Europe.
Well, if we can try real hard to squeeze one more, we'll do Urbana line 2. Hello.
Hi, is my line 2?
Yes, and you have to be quick, though.
Okay, Professor Chomsky, last question. You touched on it just briefly with the last caller. Nuts and bolts, what would you like to see the U.S., what steps would you like to see the U.S. steps would you like to see us take in light of the current situation?
On which issue?
On the issue of terrorism and the policies, throughout the world.
Well, there's one way to contribute significantly to the reduction of terrorism, and that is to stop participating in it. That will make a big difference right there, huge difference. However, that's not the whole story. There is the terrorism that's officially talked about, the terrorism of others, of the weak, and that ought to be dealt with. And I think it ought to be dealt with pretty much the way the Vatican and Michael Howard, the right-wing military historian, said, which I quoted before. They're criminal acts. They should be treated as criminal acts by careful police investigation, by apprehending criminals once you have evidence about them through an international authority, if it's international, and then a fair trial. But that should be applied to our terrorism, too.
We're going to have to stop, I'm sorry to say, because we've used the time. Professor Chomsky, thank you very much for spending some time with us today.
Okay, glad to be with you.
Our guest, Noam Chomsky, he's professor of linguistics at Massachusetts Institute of Technology and is the author of a number of books. You can look for them in the library at the bookstore. The most recent is titled 9/11. It's published by Seven Stories Press. It's a small paperback, and it's a collection of interviews that Noam Chomsky gave to various reporters from places around the world, all on the subject of the terrorist attacks of last September.